Don't touch me. You're too stupid to even carry a glass of water. The words didn't just land. They cracked through the room like a dropped crystal flute, sharp enough to turn heads, loud enough to freeze a $3.5 billion conversation mid-breath. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A violinist near the balcony missed a note. Even the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to hesitate, as if San Francisco itself was watching. At the center of it all stood Richard Coleman, a man worth more than most companies in the building, adjusting his cufflinks with the calm precision of someone who had never been told he was wrong. His suit was charcoal, custom-tailored, the kind that whispered power without needing to shout. And right in front of him, holding a tray that suddenly felt heavier than it looked, was Naomi Carter. She didn't flinch. Not when the room shifted. Not when a few quiet chuckles slipped through the crowd like nervous leaks. Not even when someone at the far end of the table muttered, "Damn," under their breath. Naomi just stood there, shoulders steady, eyes level, as if the insult had passed through her without finding a place to land. But it hadn't. It never did. It stayed. It always stayed. The private dining room at Aurelia Heights wasn't just expensive, it was curated. Every detail, from the amber lighting to the imported marble floors, was designed to remind everyone inside exactly who they were supposed to be. Important. Untouchable. In control. Tonight, it was hosting one of the largest biotech acquisition deals of the year. Investors from New York. Legal teams from Chicago. Tech advisors from Palo Alto. Numbers had been thrown around all night like confetti, but the one that mattered sat heavy in the air. $3.5 billion. That was the future being negotiated at that table. That was the kind of number that made people overlook things. Tone. Respect. Humanity. Naomi had seen it before. Not at this scale, maybe, but enough times to recognize the pattern. She had been on her feet for 9 hours already. Double shift. Rent was due in 5 days. Her younger brother's medication refill was sitting in her online cart, waiting for a paycheck that hadn't cleared yet. Life didn't give her the luxury of reacting to every insult. So she learned something else instead. How to observe. How to listen. How to wait. Richard didn't look at her again after he spoke. To him, the moment was already over. Servers didn't exist beyond function. They moved. They delivered. They disappeared. That was the system. And systems, in Richard's world, worked best when no one questioned them. He leaned back into his chair, turning his attention to the investors across from him, already mid-sentence about market expansion and projected returns. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind that closed deals and silenced doubts. But something had shifted. Subtle, almost invisible. Because while Richard had dismissed Naomi, the room hadn't fully moved on. A few glances lingered. A few brows tightened. And Naomi, she was still standing there. Still holding the tray. Still quiet. But now, just barely, there was something else in her expression. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something sharper. Something patient. The kind of look that didn't belong to someone who was defeated. The kind that belonged to someone who knew something no one else in the room had figured out yet. And for the first time that night, without anyone realizing it, the balance of power had already begun to shift. Naomi set the tray down with careful precision, the soft clink of glass against polished walnut barely audible beneath the low hum of resumed conversation. But her mind did not return to silence with the room. It sharpened, aligning pieces that most people would never even notice, because while Richard Coleman spoke in confident rhythms about projected revenue and expansion timelines, Naomi had been listening to something else entirely, not just the words but the structure behind them. The small inconsistencies buried beneath polished language, the kind that only revealed themselves if you knew where to look. And Naomi knew where to look, because long before she ever carried a tray through rooms like this, she had sat in classrooms where numbers mattered more than tone, where a single misplaced clause could cost millions, and where attention was the difference between being overlooked and being undeniable. But life had redirected her path, not erased it, and now that knowledge lived quietly beneath the surface, waiting, watching, just like she did. Richard gestured toward a digital tablet in front of one of the investors, his voice smooth, confident, rehearsed. As you can see, the compliance structure ensures full protection across all federal guidelines, he said, offering a practiced smile. The kind that usually ended discussions instead of starting them. And for a moment, it worked. Heads nodded, pens hovered, Someone whispered approval, but Naomi's eyes flicked to the screen as she reached to refill a glass. And there it was again. The same line she had caught earlier. Subtle. Almost invisible unless you understood the language behind it. Clause 14.3. Buried deep within legal phrasing. Structured to sound airtight, but carrying a flaw that was anything but small. Her fingers paused for half a second. Just enough for the thought to fully form. Just enough for certainty to replace doubt. And then she continued pouring. Steady, controlled, invisible once more, except she was not invisible anymore. Not to herself. Not to what she now knew. Across the table, one of the legal advisors adjusted his glasses, scanning the document again as if something fell off, but he could not quite name it. Richard leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift, but misreading its source. Assuming it was hesitation that needed to be pushed through. This deal positions us ahead of every competitor in the market. He continued, his tone tightening just enough to signal authority. But authority only works when it stands on solid ground. And the ground beneath this deal was beginning to crack. Naomi stepped back from the table, her posture composed, her expression calm. But inside her thoughts were moving fast, connecting timelines, regulations, implications, because if she was right, and she knew she was, this was not just a small oversight. It was a structural fault that could trigger federal review, delay implementation, and collapse investor confidence in a matter of minutes. The kind of mistake that did not just cost money. It erased trust. And trust was the one currency no billionaire could afford to lose. A quiet breath filled her lungs. Not heavy, not dramatic. Just enough to center the moment. Because moments like this did not announce themselves. They appeared quietly, disguised as routine, waiting for someone to recognize them for what they really were. An opportunity, not for attention, not for recognition, but for truth to step into a room that had been built entirely on perception. And as Richard reached for his glass without looking, already certain of the outcome, Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, measured, and clear enough to cut through the illusion without raising above it. Sir, that clause does not meet federal compliance under Section 12 of the Regulatory Code. And just like that, the room did not just pause, it shifted. The sentence did not echo, it landed, and then it stayed there, suspended in the air like something no one in the room knew how to catch, because it did not belong to the script that had been playing all night. It did not match the hierarchy everyone had silently agreed to follow, and for a brief moment, no one moved, not the investors, not the legal team, not even Richard Coleman, whose hand remained wrapped around the stem of his glass without lifting it, his expression shifting just slightly. Not yet anger, not yet concern, but something closer to interruption, the kind of pause powerful people experience when something unexpected dares to enter their control. One of the attorneys across the table frowned and leaned forward, fingers sliding across the tablet screen, scrolling back to the clause Naomi had just referenced, his lips pressing into a thin line as he reread it once. Then again, slower this time, as if the words had rearranged themselves without permission. Section 12? He murmured quietly, almost to himself, while another advisor adjusted in his chair, suddenly alert, the atmosphere tightening in a way that no amount of luxury could soften. Richard finally looked at Naomi, really looked at her for the first time that night, not as background, not as service, but as a variable he had not accounted for, his gaze sharp, evaluating, dismissive at first. That is not your concern, he said evenly, his tone controlled, but carrying an edge that expected the room to fall back into alignment, expected her to retreat into silence, expected the system to correct itself. But Naomi did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not challenge his authority directly. She simply held her ground with a calm that did not ask for permission. It becomes a concern if the clause triggers federal review, she replied, her voice steady, measured, each word placed with intention, not rushed, not hesitant, just clear, and clarity has a way of cutting through noise. That confidence alone cannot mask. The attorney's finger stopped scrolling, his eyes narrowing as realization began to form. Wait, he said, louder now, drawing attention that Richard could no longer redirect. She might be right. The words were quiet but heavy, and the moment they landed, the room shifted again, this time not with curiosity, but with pressure, because doubt had entered, and doubt spreads faster than certainty in rooms built on high stakes. Another investor leaned in, asking for the document to be shared across his screen. Murmurs replaced the earlier polished silence, not loud, but enough to fracture the rhythm Richard had carefully maintained all evening. His jaw tightened, not visibly to most, but enough for those watching closely to see the shift. Control was slipping, not dramatically, not yet, but in small, undeniable ways, and small cracks are how structures begin to fail. Naomi stepped back slightly, not to retreat, but to give the moment space to unfold without her, because she did not need to push it further. The truth had already entered the room, and truth, once seen, does not disappear. The attorney cleared his throat, his voice now firm, professional, but carrying a weight it did not have before. Clause 14.3 references a compliance pathway that was revised last quarter, he said, glancing toward Richard, then back to the screen. If this is not updated, it could invalidate the entire agreement under federal oversight. Silence followed, not the elegant kind from earlier, but something heavier, something real, and for the first time that night, Richard Coleman did not have an immediate answer, because the system he trusted, the control he built his empire on, had just been questioned by the one person he had already decided did not matter, and that was the part no one in the room could ignore. No one reached for their glass now. No one checked their phone. No one pretended this was still just another polished dinner conversation. Because the number hanging over the table had changed shape, it was no longer just opportunity. It was risk, and risk demanded attention. The attorney's words settled like weight across the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was calculating. Richard Coleman leaned forward slowly, his fingers finally releasing the glass, not out of hesitation, but control, the kind of control that had built his empire, the kind that had never failed him before. His voice came measured, precise. Run it again, he said to the legal team, not looking at Naomi, not acknowledging her, as if ignoring the source could still contain the disruption. But the disruption was already moving. Documents refreshed across multiple screens, advisors leaning closer, whispers replaced by low, urgent exchanges, numbers recalculated, implications unfolding in real time. One investor shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet tension that showed in the tightening of his jaw. Another asked for clarification, not from Richard, but from the legal counsel, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything. Because power in rooms like this was not declared, it was followed. And for the first time that night, the room was not following Richard. The attorney spoke again, slower this time, making sure every word was understood. If this clause triggers a compliance review, the deal does not just get delayed, it gets frozen, he said, glancing between the investors. And if it gets frozen, valuation changes, timelines collapse, and regulatory exposure increases. Each phrase landed heavier than the last, not because they were new concepts, but because they were now real, no longer hypothetical. Richard's expression remained composed, but the rhythm of the room had shifted beyond his immediate reach. He turned slightly toward the lead investor, offering a controlled smile that had closed deals 100 times before. This is a minor oversight, he said, smooth, confident, practiced, easily corrected. And for a moment, it almost worked. Because confidence can still carry weight when uncertainty has not fully taken root. But then the investor asked a simple question, the kind that does not sound dangerous until it is. Why was it not corrected already? And that was the moment the foundation cracked just a little wider, because the answer to that question did not exist in a way that could restore confidence. The legal team did not respond immediately, not out of defiance, but because there was no immediate defense, just a growing awareness of what had been missed. Naomi stood a few steps back now, hands lightly resting at her sides, not drawing attention, not stepping forward again, because she did not need to. The truth had already taken its place at the table, and it was speaking louder than she ever could. One of the junior analysts, younger, less practiced at hiding reactions, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "This could kill the deal." Not realizing how far those words would travel, but they did, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. The phrase moved through the room like a quiet current, subtle but powerful, reshaping every calculation, every assumption, Every expectation that had been built into the evening. Richard's gaze shifted again, this time not dismissive, not entirely controlled, but searching, recalibrating, because the situation was no longer about dominance. It was about recovery. And recovery required understanding what had just happened. His eyes landed on Naomi once more, not as background, not as interruption, but as the point where everything had changed. And in that moment, something rare crossed his expression, not defeat, not yet, but recognition, because for the first time that night, the most important voice in the room had not come from the head of the table. It had come from the one person he had already decided did not matter. The room did not recover. It recalibrated, and recalibration in a space built on certainty is never quiet. It hums beneath the surface, in tightened shoulders, in delayed responses, in the way eyes begin to shift not toward the speaker, but toward the risk. And now the risk had a shape. It had a clause. It had a consequence. And most importantly, it had a source that no one could ignore anymore. Richard Coleman exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled release, the kind that masked pressure, rather than relieved it, his mind moving fast behind a composed exterior, calculating options, identifying exits, because that was what he had always done. He did not lose control, he redirected it. "We amend the clause tonight," he said, his voice firm again, reaching for authority like it was still fully his to command. "We adjust language, refile compliance, and proceed as scheduled." It sounded decisive. It sounded clean. It sounded like a solution, but solutions only work when time is on your side, and time had already shifted. The lead investor leaned back slightly, no longer leaning in, no longer engaged in the same way, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still. "You do not amend federal exposure overnight," he replied, calm, measured, but no longer aligned. "You disclose it, you review it, and you reassess the entire structure." Each word placed carefully, not aggressive, but final in tone, and that tone carried weight that even Richard's confidence could not override. Another investor nodded. Subtly, not dramatic, not confrontational, but enough to confirm that the room was no longer unified under one direction. The legal team avoided eye contact now, not out of guilt, but because they were already thinking ahead. Damage control, liability, documentation. The conversation had moved past persuasion. It had entered consequence. Naomi remained still, her presence quiet, but no longer invisible. Because once someone changes the outcome of a room, they do not disappear from it, even if they say nothing else. One of the senior advisors cleared his throat, his voice careful, professional, but carrying a weight that did not exist earlier. "If this proceeds without full review, we are exposed," he said, glancing briefly toward Richard before returning his attention to the documents. "And exposure at this level is not theoretical." That was the moment the word shifted again, from risk to liability. And liability does not negotiate. It demands action. Richard's jaw tightened just enough to register, his posture still strong, still composed, but the center of gravity had moved, and he knew it, because power is not about speaking the most. It is about being the one others follow, and no one was following him now. The lead investor finally closed his tablet, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in a room this large. "We pause," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to. Effective immediately. Silence followed, heavier this time, not uncertain, not questioning, but decided, the kind of silence that marks an ending rather than a pause. And just like that, the number that had dominated the night, $3.5 billion, no longer existed as a future. It became a loss, not signed, not secured, not real. Richard did not move for a second, not because he could not, but because even he understood what had just happened. The deal was gone, not delayed, not adjusted, gone, and it had not been undone by a competitor, not by the market, not by some unpredictable external force, but by a single truth spoken at the exact moment it mattered most. His gaze shifted once more, landing on Naomi Carter, not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something far more difficult to hide. The realization that the one person he had reduced to nothing had just cost him everything. And across the room, without raising her voice, without stepping forward again, Naomi simply reached for the empty glasses, her movements calm, precise, unchanged. as if the night had not just rewritten itself around her, as if she had not just altered the outcome of a $3.5 billion deal with a single sentence. Because for her, this was never about the money. It was about the truth, and the truth does not need permission to be heard. The sound of chairs shifting replaced the earlier hum of ambition, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as if the room itself was beginning to exhale after holding its breath for too long. Conversations broke into fragments, not the confident negotiations from before, but quiet, measured exchanges that carried a different kind of weight, the kind that follows loss, not speculation. One investor stood, smoothing his jacket as if resetting his presence before stepping away from the table. Another followed, slower, more deliberate, each movement signaling the same unspoken conclusion. The night was no longer about opportunity. It was about distance, distance from risk, distance from association, distance from a deal that had already begun to collapse under its own oversight. Richard Coleman remained seated for a moment longer than anyone else, not out of hesitation, but calculation, his mind still moving, still searching for a path that might restore what had just been lost, because men, like him, did not accept endings easily. They looked for angles, for leverage, for ways to reframe the narrative before it settled into something permanent. But this time, there was no angle, no quick correction, no confident line that could pull the room back into alignment, because the shift had not been emotional, it had been structural, and structural failures do not respond to charisma, they respond to reality. He finally stood, adjusting his jacket with the same precision he had shown all evening, but the gesture carried a different meaning now, not dominance, but containment, as if he was holding something together that had already started to come apart. His eyes moved across the room, not searching for agreement anymore, but measuring reactions, identifying who had already stepped away and who was simply waiting to follow. And then they landed on Naomi Carter again, still near the edge of the table, still composed, still moving with quiet intention as she gathered the last of the empty glasses, her presence unchanged, her expression neutral, as if the magnitude of what had just happened did not need to be acknowledged for it to be real. Richard took a step toward her, not rushed, not aggressive, but deliberate, the kind of step that carried purpose even when the outcome was uncertain. "You," he said, the words simple, stripped of the earlier tone, no longer dismissive, no longer sharp, just direct. Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without apology, without the need to lower herself to match the hierarchy that had already begun to dissolve. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but between them, because this was no longer about a server and a client. It was about two people standing on opposite sides of a moment that had just redefined both of their positions. Richard's voice came quieter now, controlled but no longer untouchable. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a question that carried something unfamiliar to him, the need to understand. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not have one, but because she understood the weight of timing, the same way she had understood the weight of her words earlier. She placed the final glass onto the tray, aligning it carefully before speaking, her voice calm, steady, unchanged. "The same place you did," she said, and for the first time that night, Richard did not have a response ready, because the distance he had assumed existed between them had just been erased with a single sentence. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And as the last of the investors made their way toward the exit, leaving behind a table that no longer held value, only consequence, the reality of the moment settled in fully. The deal was gone, the room was emptying, and the one person who had changed everything was already turning away, not to claim anything, not to prove anything further, but simply to continue her work, as if the power she had just revealed was never about being seen, but about being known. The room did not empty all at once. It unraveled, thread by thread, conversation by conversation, until what had once felt like a fortress of certainty became nothing more than a quiet space filled with the aftermath of a decision no one could reverse. The staff moved more slowly now, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because even they could feel that something unusual had just taken place, something that would be talked about long after the lights dimmed and the tables were reset. Naomi Carter stepped toward the service station near the back wall, placing the tray down with the same care she had shown all night, her movements consistent, deliberate, untouched by the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Because for her, control was never about dominating a room. It was about maintaining herself within it. A manager approached briefly, his expression tight, uncertain whether to ask questions or simply observe, but Naomi gave him nothing to react to, no explanation, no performance, just quiet professionalism, and that in itself felt louder than anything else in the room. Behind her, Richard Coleman remained where he stood, not frozen, but paused, the kind of pause that comes when a man is forced to reconsider not just a moment, but a pattern, because what had happened tonight was not an accident. It was a reflection, and reflections are difficult to ignore once they are clear. He glanced toward the exit where the last of the investors had disappeared, their absence more telling than any words they could have spoken, and then his attention returned to Naomi, who was now wiping down the edge of the table as if it were just another shift, just another night, just another room that would be reset and forgotten. Except this one would not be forgotten, not by him. He took another step forward, slower this time, less certain, as if the distance between them carried more weight than it had earlier. "You said the same place," he repeated, his voice quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty, not demanding an answer, but seeking one. Naomi did not turn immediately. She finished aligning the last glass, her fingers steady, her posture composed, because timing still mattered, even now. She turned only when she was ready, meeting his gaze again without hesitation. "I studied finance," she said simply, no embellishment, no need to impress, just the truth. Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in disbelief, but in recalibration, because that answer did not fit the version of reality he had operated under just minutes ago. "Then why are you here?" he asked, the question direct, but no longer layered with judgment, just confusion, genuine this time. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment before answering, not defensively, not emotionally, just honestly. "Because life does not always follow the plan you start with," she said, her voice even, grounded. "But that does not mean you forget what you learned." The words settled between them, simple, but heavier than anything that had been said earlier that night, because they did not just explain her, they revealed something about him, something he had never needed to question before. The idea that value does not disappear just because it is not visible. Richard exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but recognition, the kind that does not come easily to someone used to being right. "You cost me that deal," he said finally, not as an accusation, not as blame, but as a statement of fact, and Naomi did not deny it, did not soften it, did not step away from it. She simply met it with the same calm she had carried all night. "No," she said, her voice steady. "That clause did." And for a moment, Richard said nothing, because he understood the difference, the kind of difference that does not just change outcomes, it changes perspective. And as the last light above the table dimmed slightly, casting softer shadows across the now quiet room, the truth remained where it had always been, not loud, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore, because it had never been about who had power in the room. It had always been about who had clarity, and clarity, once revealed, does not ask for permission to stay. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt earned, the kind that settles only after something has been fully understood, not just heard. And in that quiet, the room seemed smaller, not because the walls had moved, but because the illusion of power that once filled it had faded, leaving behind something more honest, more grounded. Naomi Carter picked up the folded linen from the edge of the table and smoothed it out with practiced hands, her movements steady, unaffected, as if this space, with all its tension and consequence, was no different from any other shift she had worked, because for her, consistency was not about circumstance, it was about character. Richard Coleman remained where he stood, but the distance between who he had been at the start of the night and who he was now could not be measured in steps. It was something deeper, something quieter, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes everything it touches. He looked around the room one more time, not searching for approval, not expecting agreement, but acknowledging what was no longer there, the attention, the alignment, the certainty, all of it gone. replaced by the undeniable weight of a moment he could not undo, and for the first time in a long time, he did not try to fix it immediately. He did not reach for a strategy or a statement. He simply stood in it, letting the reality exist without resistance. Because sometimes the most difficult thing for someone used to control is not losing it. It is accepting that it was never absolute to begin with. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step away from the table, her shift not yet over, her responsibilities unchanged. Because life does not pause for moments like this, even when they carry consequences measured in billions. Richard watched her for a second longer before speaking again, his voice quieter now, not out of weakness, but intention. You knew exactly when to say it, he said, not questioning, not accusing, just acknowledging. Naomi paused, not turning fully, but enough to respond. Timing matters, she said simply, her tone even, as if she were stating something obvious, something universal, and in a way, she was, because timing had always been the difference between being heard and being ignored, between impact and invisibility. Richard nodded slightly, more to himself than to her, the realization settling in layers, not all at once, but enough to understand that what had happened tonight was not just about a missed clause or a lost deal. It was about perspective, about assumptions, about the quiet ways people decide who matters before they ever listen, and how those decisions shape outcomes more than any contract ever could. He took a breath, steady, controlled, but different from before, less about maintaining image and more about grounding himself in what was now real. You should not be doing this job, he said, the words direct, but no longer carrying the weight of judgment. Instead, they held something closer to recognition. Naomi finally turned fully this time, meeting his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unguarded. I am doing it, she replied, not defensive, not dismissive, just factual. And that was the difference. She was not defined by the position she held in that moment. She was defined by the clarity she carried within it. Richard absorbed that quietly, because it challenged something fundamental in the way he had always seen the world, the idea that roles determine value, that titles define worth, and that influence belongs only to those who claim it loudly. But tonight had proven something else entirely, that value can exist without recognition, that clarity can emerge from anywhere, and that power, real power, is not about who speaks the most, but about who sees the most clearly. Naomi picked up the tray once more, her posture steady, her pace unhurried, and began to walk toward the service door, not waiting for acknowledgement, not expecting anything in return, because she had not acted for reward. She had acted because it was right. And as she reached the edge of the room, the soft light catching the outline of her silhouette against the doorway, Richard remained where he was, no longer the center of the room, no longer the voice everyone followed, but something else now, something quieter, something more aware, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that the most important lesson of the night had not been written in numbers or contracts. It had been spoken in a single moment of clarity, by someone he had almost chosen not to hear, and that was not something he would forget. The door to the service hallway closed softly behind Naomi Carter, and with that quiet click, the last trace of the night's tension seemed to settle into the walls of the room she had just left behind. But the impact of what had happened did not stay there. It moved. It traveled. It lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, because moments like that do not disappear when the lights dim. They echo. Richard Coleman stood alone now, the table cleared, the chairs slightly misaligned. The glow of the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He walked slowly to the edge of the window, his reflection staring back at him, not distorted, not unfamiliar, but different in a way he could not ignore, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about the next deal, the next move, the next win. He was thinking about a moment he did not control, a sentence he did not anticipate, a truth he did not see coming. And that realization carried more weight than the loss itself. $3.5 billion was a number he could rebuild. He had done it before. He would do it again. But clarity, the kind he had just encountered, the kind that exposed a flaw not just in a contract but in perspective, that was not something he could simply replace. He turned slightly, looking back at the empty table where it had all unfolded. The exact spot where he had spoken without thinking, where he had dismissed without looking, where he had assumed without knowing. And now that space held a different meaning, not as a place of power, but as a reminder, because power without awareness is fragile. And tonight had proven just how quickly it could shift across the building, down a quieter corridor lined with stainless steel and soft fluorescent light. Naomi moved through the service area with the same steady rhythm she had carried all evening, placing the tray down, rinsing glasses, resetting for the next table, because her night was not over. Her responsibilities had not changed, and the world outside that private room continued forward without pause. One of her coworkers glanced at her briefly, sensing something had happened but not fully understanding what. Naomi offered a small nod, nothing more, because not every moment needs to be explained to be real. Not every impact needs to be announced to be meaningful. She tied her apron a little tighter, adjusted her sleeves, and stepped back onto the floor, ready for the next order, the next table, the next moment that might come without warning, because she understood something most people did not. That preparation is not always about what you expect. It is about who you are when the unexpected arrives. Back in the quiet dining room, Richard took one last look before turning toward the exit, his steps measured, not rushed, not heavy, but thoughtful, as if each one carried a new awareness he had not walked with before. He did not reach for his phone, did not call his team, did not attempt to immediately rebuild what had been lost, because for once, he allowed the moment to stay with him, uncorrected, unedited, real. And as he walked out into the night, the city lights reflecting off polished glass and distant water, one truth remained clearer than anything else. It was never the volume of a voice that defined its power. It was the clarity behind it. And sometimes, the person you overlook is the one who sees everything you miss.